The importance of engraving, I don't think we realized really how incredibly important engravings were in terms of being a stock of ideas for artists. All across Europe by the time Callot is working, artists like Rembrandt certainly owned Lucas van Leyden prints, he owned Callot's, he owned a vast array of prints. Two of Callot's mentors had really effective collections of prints that Callot could look at, and especially that reproductive engraving, that's how they're getting those ideas.
This is Platemark. My name is Anne Shafer, and I am your host. You have found us at Series 2 of Platemark, A History of Western Prints. Today's episode is the first half of a conversation True and I had about Jacques Callot. So it goes on for 55 minutes or so, and the second part of it covers, obviously, the remainder of Callot's career. And I'll release that as a separate episode because I don't feel like an hour, more than an hour is too much, right? You agree, right? Any of the images that we talk about, and of course with Callot there's tons of them because they're all about the size of a quarter. All of those images will be over at platemarkpodcast.com in the show notes. You can also do me a favor by clicking the support and donate button. Help me keep the lights on here at Platemark. I'd really appreciate it. And also notice there's a little microphone icon on platemarkpodcast.com. If you click it, you can leave me a 60-second voicemail message, or you could ask True a question because, you know, he has all the answers. All right, I think that is it. Buckle up and let's get rolling. Welcome to Platemark.
Hello.
Oh, hi.
Thank you.
It's been a while.
It has been a wee bit.
Yeah, it took us a long time to get through reproductive prints.
It certainly did. Reproduction can be very time-consuming and labor-intensive. It was a toughie because it's an awkward, odd, strange,
It is weird.
amorphous subject, and there's so much more new scholarship that is coming forward on it. And
It's hard to wrangle, for sure. You did a great job.
you're very kind. I felt like I was herding cats, but
It is hurting cats, really.
okay,
Yeah.
better than earthworms.
All right, so today we are here to talk about Jacques Callot.
Oh my God, are you guys in for a treat?
But before we do that,
Are you going to tell me I have to tell you where I'm positioned?
I'm going to tell you where I'm positioned.
You
but
go
it's
ahead.
Only correct.
Fine, go for it.
I identify as a cishet white woman, and I use the pronoun she, her.
I identify as a trans white gay male using the pronouns he, him.
Okay, we are recording this in Baltimore, Maryland at the Purple Crayon Press.
Booyah.
The land of the Piscataway Conway people.
And boy, are we glad we're here.
We are. I'm glad we're back together because the holiday break was long.
Yeah, this is the first time I've seen this fabulous human being in almost a month, and that's just not right.
Yeah, that was a long
Texting does not work.
A little more.
There's no hugging in texting.
All right, so Monsieur Callot.
He's one of these
Wait, but
people.
before we go,
Yes.
I just want to note that we've been talking about trends and movements, and suddenly we're going to start hitting singular artists.
Occasionally, yeah, I think we have to.
Yeah.
You're right about that. I was concerned about how we wanted to go about approaching this because we finished off the reproductive print chat with Peter Paul Rubens and how he had been nearly assassinated by Lucas Vorsterman, his engraver. And we'd finished off with an image that I think the both of us just kind of, I felt as though I missed an opportunity. And so I want to be able to use that image of Hercules slaying Discord as a interesting and worthwhile segue to Jacques Callot, because this is a printmaker who is on the border of the Mannerist movement. He's at the beginning of the Baroque movement, and yet he's entirely himself. And in one respect, one could almost say he's a social realist. And it's not even fair to say somebody's outside of their time. He made his visual time. Jacques Callot never painted anything. He made his entire career on just his prints. Over 1,400 of them.
What?
Yeah.
Holy shit.
And in so doing, he learned the trade by being apprenticed to a goldsmith, and he had to learn how to use the burin because that's what engraving was. But the thing that you'll come to realize is how clever and innovative he was by inventing new ways of making the much more facile medium of etching look like the much more time-consuming medium of engraving. Because engraving, as you may or may not recall, is plowing into that beautiful piece of copper with a sharp beveled edge of a burin, and it requires incredible control without tension, in being able to put the speed and the placement and the weight into the curve of a line, and it gives a very precise, clean line that has a swell and a taper. That's its trademark appearance. It's the kind of line you might see on the engraving on the side of the silver that was given for... Nobody does silver sets anymore, do they?
Oh, yeah, you're right.
Yeah, but once upon a time, having your initials engraved on the side of it, or even on the inside of a wedding ring, or
a trophy or something.
Exactly. But Callot had also studied with somebody named Parigi in Italy and learned some of the subtleties of etching, and then invented a new tool, which we'll talk about in a little bit, which made it possible for him to create the swells and the tapers with the line he was scribing into the super hard ground that he himself had adapted for etching. It was much harder than the kind that you've been able to experiment with me. The ones that we use generally, like a ball ground in a print shop, it's mixed with a tar-like substance, asphaltum, some people say wax, but his had a mastic that was much harder, so he could scribe into it and would hold the sharpness of his line extremely well.
And why was he faking engraving?
Well, thank you for asking that. It's difficult to try and approach, how do I get into Jacques Callot, one of my heroes, if you will, because you want to say he stands by himself, and he does, but he doesn't, because there he is in the thick of things at a time that the Catholic Church has had to rearrange itself. It's going through its own reformation. He's figuring out how to work within an entire system of a public that's not just the bourgeoisie of which he came, and then his family had been elevated into a noble status, and they were very shrewd people. But then he also worked and had a very courtier-like attitude and was respected for how he behaved when he worked for the Medici family down in Florence.
But where's he from? We haven't said where he's from.
Thank you for asking that, because in one respect, let's put Mr. Callot, who was born in 1592 and died in 1635 at the ripe age of only 43, which is pretty tragic, really. He died of, more than likely, an ulcer, a stomach ulcer, or cancer of the stomach. There's a fascinating biography that was written by Howard Daniel that really puts it in perspective beautifully. But let's put him in the time and place. He was growing up in the Duchy of Nancy. I don't want to say Nancy, but I don't want to sound like an Iowan when I say Nancy, Nancy. Nancy, which was an independent duchy, which was right between France and the Holy Roman Empire that was being run by the Habsburg family, which included most of the Germanies and Spain, of course, and Italy. And so it's rife with religious conflict. And Callot is in this independent duchy that is actually Catholic itself. But when you read about this guy and you think about how artists have to adapt to the times in which they live, this is a perfect case in point, because the Duchy of Lorraine is where he was born, and he was born at a time of great, as Mr. Daniel says, economic and political crisis. And it's reflected in the kinds of images he makes. And I wanted to just share this one paragraph with you. This period saw a drop in general production and a decline in commerce. At the same time, there was a steady and continuous rise in the price of all commodities. On top of this, Europe was stricken by a resurgence of epidemic diseases of a particular virulence. Phenomenally cold weather was largely responsible for recurrent famines, particularly in France. Let's just think about what we're dealing with right now. Fucked up economy, and the prices of everything are going up, and we have a pestilence that we don't understand, and the weather's been fucked up because of climate change.
Hello.
And it's not that different. Yeah. And then there's this whole concept of the religious fractiousness. You have one side that can't tolerate the other, and there's going to be all kinds of wars. You can't even maybe get somebody elected to be the Speaker of the House, for God's sake. It's just bigger. It's amazing how the more things change, the more they stay the same. So the idea of Callot growing up in this time and place, to a father who had come up through the ranks of a bourgeois kind of upbringing in the 1500s. It's interesting. His father was a very shrewd kind of a fellow. Lorraine was militantly Catholic up there in the northeast corner of what would eventually become France. But his father had positioned himself well in the court. Here's part of what I have for years, given the story, which may or may not be true, it turns out, that his parents wanted him to be a part of the clergy, and Callot went, screw that, and he ran off to Italy. And that may or may not be true, because the part that one would have to question is that 5 of Callot's 7 brothers and sisters were all part of some branch of the Franciscan order of the Catholic Church.
Wow.
5 of the 7 of them.
Oh my gosh.
Right? But, and I want to know what the other one was doing. I think actually he was positioned to become, it was a time of incredible shrewdness. But Dad was doing really smart things, trying to get people positioned so that the family can move up in the ladder and whatnot. Callot was eventually apprenticed to someone, and his father paid a really tremendous amount of money for him to be the apprentice to this individual. No dad is going to pay that kind of college tuition to send somebody to learn if they don't believe in it at all. But at the same time, Callot is very Catholic, apparently. That's what the literature says. So the other thing that I think is fascinating is understanding that Lorraine, the Duchy of Lorraine, was being run by the Duke, Charles III, who had a 63-year reign, and he died in 1608. Callot's grandfather had been working for Duke Charles III, and then his son, Jean, was also subsequently, because his dad had been working for them, became a part of the corps of archers for the Duke. And then some years later, he became the herald of the court. A herald, like somebody that's like a crier that does like pronounce like...
Prince Charles has had a baby.
Yeah. A court herald.
Yeah.
And he was an organizer of some functions. Eventually, he rose further and further up the ranks and was more part of the courtly life. And he was actually able to do these duties tax-free. He became so well enmeshed in the court that he didn't have to pay taxes.
Oh, boy.
And he was still a part of the bourgeoisie, but now he was a part of the noble bourgeoisie. So he had worked his way up through into a nobility status, like a Mr. Little Sub-Noble kind of a guy. This is Callot's dad. And eventually became an organizer of festivals and pageants and all kinds of activities that were...
He was the Noble Cruise Director?
Yeah, yeah, which is pretty wild. So Dad has been working for Duke Charles III. Charles III dies in 1608. His son, Duke Henry II, takes over, and he does a wonderful job continuing the father's desire to have Lorraine be full of great arts and that kind of thing. Even though it was the backwater, they're really trying to bring up the arts, and they're using the arts as many would in the early Baroque era, and certainly in the high Baroque era, of anything the arts can do to elevate the status of the nobility in that area is really what it's about. You're supposed to show your wealth and show how good you are and how smart you are. And so those kinds of festivals are tremendously important. Eventually, this is a very snarky little line, Duke Henry II, son of Charles III, reigned for a period of 16 reasonably peaceful and uneventful years. His successor, Charles IV, was a nephew of Henry who married Henry's daughter. In a particularly troubled time, Charles IV was not a particularly able ruler, and his political intrigues led to the invasion of Lorraine and the occupation of Nancy in 1633 by, and this is where our high point of Callot's career is, it was invaded by Richelieu and Louis XIII of France.
Oh.
So you can see this arc of the family rising through the ranks, a time of decent ruling, and then some kind of limp next heir coming through, doing a crappy-ass job. It's all in the family. So by the time, it's kind of like shirt sleeves to shirt sleeves in 3 generations thing. It's just the grandfather has done such a good job, and then the next generation does even better, and then the son of them or the next inheritor, it takes it back down. And it's tragic to see how that'll work that way. So with Charles IV, things go down the toilet, and that is all part of this time of the 30 Years' War. Okay, you got your 100 Years' War, you got your 30 Years' War. How do you keep all of those? I know, right. So the 30 Years' War is the one that's going to be really important to Jacques Callot's story. And that is essentially 1618 to 1648, and that is concluded with the Treaty of Westphalia, and that is actually the same 30 Years' War that I want you to start thinking about how that relates completely to Peter Paul Rubens and to Rembrandt. All of those same activities. These guys are all
Republic, right?
They're all essentially peers, but they're taking the Baroque and doing what they have to with their artwork in their very different ways. Rembrandt resolutely in a Protestant part of the world. Peter Paul Rubens, resolutely part of the Catholic Counter-Reformation. And if you think about how do you elevate the status of the aristocracy, let's think about the cycle of 24 paintings that Rubens did of Marie de Medici, right? And he contracted to do that, and he said, I'll get it done in 4 years flat, and he did. It's just, these artists are working their way through. And actually, Callot is not that far off from the dates of Caravaggio. It's such a burgeoning time.
We always do Callot so much later than all the rest.
I know.
He's right in the
He's
mix.
absolutely in the thick of it.
Yeah.
And so towards the end of this, I'm going to make you start to realize that Rubens and Velázquez and Callot are all talking about the same thing. It's just when you start to really connect the time dots. And I know in your world and on the lists that we worked from when we were teaching history of prints, it's like, well, those are in those boxes over there, and it comes out for the...
Well, he's French, and this is the first French artist.
He's not French, though. I know. He's air quotes French, because remember, the Duchy of Lorraine was independent, and it wasn't French at the time.
All right.
But he gets lumped in with the Frenchies.
He does.
But that's because Goya, he's in his own zone. If you think about Goya, who is is he a neoclassical artist? Is he a Rococo artist? Sometimes he is when he's designing all those tapestries for the rich people. But is he a romantic artist? Oh yeah, when he's doing pictures of Saturn biting the head off of one of his kids. But he's just this rich organism unto himself that produces all kinds of change. And that's what Callot does too with his 1,400 plus etchings. In this very roundabout way, I'm trying to get us to a point where we realize that Callot is coming from a time where his father, through shrewd family positioning, has gotten his kids into good spots with the Franciscan order, with the Catholic Church, and his son Callot. He's come to realize you're going to apprentice to a goldsmith, and eventually he'll actually pay for him to do an apprenticeship with Thomason, an engraver down in Florence. So it must not be that Callot ran away. It must be that he went to Rome first and then Florence, because his family said, yeah, okay. But all this time I've been going, oh yeah, he didn't want to do it, he ran away. And it's because the literature, the biographies of his time were taken from folks that was oral tradition. And so it's not until well, you wouldn't say the 1970s or fairly recently, but I could, relatively recently. We talked about how Callot is coming from a bourgeois noble family, which is pretty exciting. During that time, though, Nancy had been full of raping and pillaging and burning in the 1580s. And so that became the kinds of stories that he would hear about as a kid.
Wait, why?
Because there were these other sieges and...
because he was a little independent duchy.
Yeah, and there are French Protestant armies and there are Catholic armies and there's all of this stuff going down. And so here's a lovely line from Howard Daniels' thing. There was no doubt that tales of the raping, plunder, and destruction of the village, which was then the main source of the Callot family's prosperity, must have constantly regaled the early childhood of Jacques Callot. He's growing up in a time for him in his home, things were pretty good. And it was a period of relative stability, but it was hard-earned. And he had an experience of a dad who's well-positioned. They're in no need or desire, but he's born into a noble family. Essentially a prosperous family. Not a noble family, a family that had managed to ennoble themselves, which I think is remarkable. And having spent time seeing the kinds of fêtes, the kinds of activities that his dad would have organized, then that's the kind of thing that he would have been excited about. Now, let's think about what happens when Charles III, his dad's patron that he's working for, dies in 1608. Okay, so what happens to Dad? Okay, what are we going to do? This is really an interesting thing. The funeral of... Okay, there's another great... I can't go without reading this. Okay. This is more Howard Daniel. It was just too much. And Anne's telling me, you don't have to do all that. And I was like, yeah, but I want to. Because
I love it when you do.
Get this. There was a popular saying in the early 17th century that the most impressive sights in Europe were the coronation of the French king at Reims, the crowning of the German emperor at Frankfurt, and the burial of Duke of Lorraine at Nancy.
What?
The funeral arrangements for Charles III, who died in 1608, lasted for about 2 months.
What?
And were directed by Callot's father.
Whoa.
Several thousand notables participated in the ceremonies, which reached their climax at the funeral procession and interment. It might well be assumed that the young Jacques, already apprenticed to an engraver of precious metals attached to the court, assisting his father, that's really what helped imprint him on thinking all of these glorious kinds of highfalutin things must be 2 months. And that's apparently not the only time this kind of long range, because it was these festivals that were what the nobility, that's all they could do. It's really interesting to realize how I started reading it and thinking about the song in Camelot where they're going, what do the simple folk do?
Oh, right.
Because the wealthy are having these massive festivals. If somebody dies, if there's a wedding, they go on for weeks and weeks and weeks. And that's how you make a living. So imagine this fellow, this young man, and fetes, ceremonies, and pageants are playing an extremely important role in diverting the feudal aristocracy from their customary grappling with power. In a sense, they served as a sort of opium to the upper classes.
Oh.
It makes sense.
Huh. Yeah.
It's not that different from now, if you really think about it. So, let's see, there was another. The tournament was a colorful and sometimes bloody ritual in which a now largely powerless aristocracy could act out its power fantasies.
Oh, wow.
So, this is the way he's growing up, and he's being apprenticed, he's learning to draw, he's learning how to engrave, and he's also acquired this very courtly attitude. He knows how to comport himself, he's very bright, he's learning important lessons from an abbé. So he was being taught reading, writing, arithmetic, music, including singing, church decoration, a little astronomy and geometry, and the elements of grammar. This was an educated young man.
No kidding.
And so he's at 14 or 15, he's been apprenticed with a court jeweler or goldsmith, and that's when he's learning engraving. That's what they're doing on gold. But it's Callot who is going to switch things up for himself, as you will see in a little tiny bit. So the very first image I'm showing Anne is a marvelous portrait of Jacques Callot. Jacobus Callot. Calcographicus aquaforti non sei in Lotharingia. Okay, he's somebody who draws in aquaforti. What's that?
Etching.
Yeah, strong water. He's from, and Nancy was part of Lotharingia at the time.
Oh, okay.
All right. Talk to me about what you're seeing in this portrait of Jacobus Callot as an adult.
This is from the iconography.
I will get to that.
Sorry. This is by Van Dyck. Okay, he looks satisfied with himself, and he's got his tools in front of him, and he's actively drawing something. Mm-hmm. Can't really tell what.
It's interesting when you look at the kind of tools. He's got a straight edge and some
like
an architect's scribe and perhaps an inkwell. It could be that he's even holding an échoppe. If you look very carefully there, you can see a coat of arms on the piece of paper that's right in front of him. Why, if I didn't know better, I'd say those are the Medici balls. Oh. That's the Medici coat of arms right there. Oh. He had worked for Cosimo down in Florence for a long time.
So the nod to Cosimo?
Oh, yeah, to the Medici family. Another big event in the life of Callot was the marriage of Marie de Medici to Henry of France. But all of these important marriages are all part of it too, and so he was aware of these things. So talk to me about, I think of printmakers, and what is your vision of a printmaker, please?
It's not a satin ruffled gown with a gigantic lace collar, for sure.
Exactly. My apron doesn't exactly have a lace collar to it, nor a lovely golden chain with some kind of important medallion and a fine coiffure. And look at
he's got a little Van Dyck.
I was going to say, can you see what kind of a mustache and lovely little goatee he has? It's a Van Dyck, which is adorable considering this portrait was drawn and etched by Van Dyck. Correct. Uh-huh. And the thing I was trying to tie that to was that, again, putting him in the moment with Van Dyck and Rubens, that Van Dyck had created this etching of the head of him, but then he would hand it off to an engraver. And so for me to be able to get across the point that the etching is like handwriting, and it's nice and fluid and autographic, that's why we call it like an autograph. But the engraving is a much stiffer, harder kind of an activity. And so when we spoke last, we had talked about in the reproductive print, we talked about Van Dyck, and we talked about how he was the prize pupil of Rubens and had created this iconography, which was this huge bevy of portraits, etched / engraved portraits of great artists, architects, and minds of his time. And that's as big as the first biographies of artists. Remember who wrote those?
That would be Vasari.
Correct. And now they're star power, right? Put pictures with these guys. We don't even have to tell their stories. You can see how fantastic they are right off the bat. So if we take a look at the Callot, you can get a sense of the freshness of the etching on the face by Van Dyck, but then you can really start looking at the background and how it was systematically engraved, and it's all parallel and perfect, and of course the letters at the bottom were obviously engraved. But the finery of this etcher, who made an incredible career as a printmaker, as big as the big boys. And if you think about how we talked about how the Baroque era is about superlatives, and it has to be the biggest and the brightest and the best and the loudest. And he can make things look enormous in the tiniest little area. He's making etchings, but he's showing us such a vast amount of space in a space that might be 3 by 7 inches.
But it's curious, the patrons of the Duchy of Nancy, wherever we are, I mean, do they not have people painting for them? And
of course.
Who are those people?
That's funny to hear. We don't need to hear about them as much. It's funny to hear how Howard Daniel talks about that's a real backwater. Florence was a backwater of Rome, and Nancy was a backwater of Florence. And once the Callot got back from Florence, he dreamt all the time of going back to Florence. He missed it terribly, but he stayed in Nancy where his family was, and so on and so forth. I think about all those students that go abroad and come back, it's not New Jersey's just not Florence. At any rate, I wanted to share that. I think the portrait is an important place to start so that you can realize that he is in this milieu with these painters and artists that have these massive, beautiful florid marks, brush strokes and whatnot. And he is, with a burin or with an etching needle, as facile and virtuosic with line as Rubens is with a brush stroke, as the beautiful florid kinds of marks that he makes. Another thing I wanted to point out, when we finished that last episode on reproductive prints, and we talked about how Rubens took a very active part in how his printmakers were, his woodcutter, Christopher Jaeger, or poor Vorsterman, who was doing the engraving of his fine paintings. He was really observing that very carefully. And I think Anne and we looked at this, and I want you to repeat to me what your initial intent was of what's your first takeaway of seeing this image of Hercules triumphant over discord. What's happening in this image?
It's this sort of older gentleman with a giant club about to beat up a woman who I took many times looking at it to recognize as a woman. And we had a discussion about discord being not a woman being beaten up, but envy and this idea of...
You're thinking about... If you put this in context of its time, and it's done about 1635, Hercules, the strongest of the strong, with his lion skin. I've also shown you portraits where Cosimo de' Medici was wearing armor that showed Hercules on it, and he had a lion skin. He was equating himself with Hercules.
Which one was that? Damn it.
That's way back in the middle of...
way back.
But don't sweat it, because it keeps coming back. But look at how this righteous, mighty, virile, sculptural kind of older man is beating... I still think that's definitely a woman, even though there's...
there's her boobs right there. But very
Laocoonish, very good.
I can't say it, Laocoonish.
It is Laocoon, not Lackawanna. It's not in Pennsylvania. Laocoon. But the other thing is, notice that, but behind Hercules is what? What's that little fella?
Oh, a puto.
It's a puto. It's a Cupid, an emissary of love, as opposed to discord, who is breaking things apart. That whole time, Rubens, at the same time, was putting out his paintings of the Garden of Love. Right? Same year that he's doing this incredible painting of the consequences of war. The idea of what can you do to quell these problems. It's amazing to think. I started realizing, man, I really missed a moment here, realizing that this was a mythological take on a contemporary problem. Hercules triumphant over discord. What can we do to quell these wars? What can we do to have Putin pull his fucking troops out of
Ukraine.
Exactly.
Right.
And the more I looked at these images, like, God, that's Ukraine. God, that's Vietnam. And I just started realizing the meat and potatoes of what Callot was doing, and really thinking about what's the language that they have of their time and their place.
But we think Callot was fully aware of Rubens' prints.
Absolutely.
Okay.
Absolutely. I don't think there's a soul on the continent of Europe that couldn't have known him by that time. Callot dies in 1635, and Rubens dies just 5 years later. It's a fascinating time, and they're so intertwined if you think about it. What's the fast part of the story? So he's born in a noble family, 1592, the Duchy of Lorraine, which as we now know is part of France. And so at the age of 16, did he run away from his dad to go to Rome, or did he go with dad's blessing? Go on, go ahead, go learn, apprentice with this fellow in Rome. And he does, but some of the literature says that when he was apprenticing with the guy, and I think it was the engraver in Rome, he wasn't real pleased because Callot was too interesting to his wife.
Oh, no.
I imagine this handsome young courtly fellow comes down, and there is also the possibility that he's actually starting to outshine his master,
yes, I wonder.
of course. So at one point he goes back to Nancy, then he goes back down. He goes from Rome to Florence, and there was another reason. I believe some Medici family member had died, and there was an etcher there who has been told that you have to do a cycle of 29 etchings about the death of this particular family member. And the guy's, it's Tempesta. And he's, whoa. And so he gets any help he can get, and it happens to be this young man, Callot, who just pops into town at just the right moment.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah. So Callot is in the right place at the right time for many things. Well, we're all excited about Callot, and we understand that he's already perfected the art of engraving, which is a world different from etching. Because etching is, in one respect, very easy. In another respect, it's not, because you have to know how long to bite something and so on. Callot actually extended that process by making timed, stepped acid. He would put things in scribe them, bite them for a very short time, and then bite another passage for a much longer time, so that you would really get a foreground, middle ground, and background, much like looking at a stage set, like the actors in the foreground, and then the set, and then the scrim in the back. And Callot manages to do all of those things. The world of difference between engraving and etching, I think, is really quite phenomenal.
Is this where we're going to actually do it?
Engrave it?
I'll include some details of engraved lines and
Absolutely.
etched lines?
Absolutely.
All right.
And that's why I think it's important to show, and then some close-ups, because there's a couple passages. There's one in a Hind that shows the Dürer, and then the engraved the etched lines of, let's say, Parmigianino, which is just raggedy and relaxed. And it's really helpful to see that. So Van Dyck had done this portrait of Vorsterman in 1626. That's right in the thick of the whole Callot lifespan. And so I wanted to keep that in mind. This is also where we would want to show them what an échoppe looks like. And it's interesting. It may seem simpler than it is. Essentially, you take a shaft of metal and you bevel the end of it so it's ovoid at a kind of a 60-degree angle, so that when you rotate your wrist as you're pulling it through the super hard ground, it replicates the swell and the taper of an engraved line.
But it's like using a calligraphy pen.
Yes, very good. Yeah, like making the letter S, but all you're doing is you're only having to drag that through the ground. You're not having to dig into a plate. And so if you get facile enough, it's almost like a John Singer Sargent kind of facility, and you get that good, but you let the chemicals do the work. The amount of work, the prints that you can create, that's why you went 1,400,
right,
because he could etch them, right? Mm-hmm. But they look like engravings, which of course were highly prized. The importance of engraving, I don't think we realized really how incredibly important prints were in engravings in terms of being a stock of ideas for artists. All across Europe by the time Callot is working, artists like Rembrandt certainly owned Lucas van Leyden prints, he owned Callot's, he owned a vast array of prints. Two of Callot's mentors had really effective collections of prints that Callot could look at. And engraving, especially that reproductive engraving, that's how they're getting those ideas. So you have this new way of, he's figuring it out, how to make the one thing look like another.
And the reason he's doing it is because he feels that he can get higher prices for those prints in that style? Or
I would think that's got to be part of it.
It must be.
I think it absolutely has to be a part of it. And you know what he can do is he can get those, this is the worst. I'm showing Anne an astonishing print. I would give my left arm to see this one. I really would.
Yeah, I've never seen this one either.
The fan, it's ridiculous. Done after 1619. Now this is done when he's down in Florence, and it was one of these huge entertainments that was created for the Grand Duke Cosimo II Medici, because the rich need to have their play dates, because otherwise life is too boring. And what are you seeing here? Just talk to me about this.
It's not really a fan shape, it's a fan shape vignette-ish frame that little people are sitting on and looking through and into a much lighter, retreating atmospheric landscape where there's tons and tons of people and lots of stuff going on a lake, maybe.
And then it recedes further and further into the background, and there are fireworks.
Oh, yeah, there they are.
And all kinds of crazy activities. And so you can totally see the foreground, middle ground, background. And in the foreground, why is it shaped this way? This is the most ridiculous part. What it shows is this festival, which was a battle between, it was a staged battle between two different guilds in Florence. One is the Weavers Guild and one is the Dyers Guild. And they're having this staged battle, pretending to have a war, and with the fireworks and all of this. And it was held on the River Arno on July 25th, 1619. The etching was created to be pasted onto the fans that the people that could go to that could take home as souvenirs.
Oh my.
And if you really look at it, it also even says on it, the Battle of blah, 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 blah. It says it right there. You can see these wonderful grotesque faces.
Yeah, the grotesques are great.
And that's purely imagined. Look how incredibly sculptural, three-dimensional, melting griffin face in the foreground. It's a stunning image. But there's something else about when Callot gets to Florence, because he learns even more. He gets to study...
Two different color inks?
No.
What?
It's just one color. And that's the beauty of this. I love the fact you're like, what? Because it's one color ink, but why does it look like different colors of ink? Why? Think about it. Because the middle ground lines are so much lighter, and the lines in the far back are so much lighter.
Right.
They're whispering.
But even between one of these foreground figures that's holding a telescope and the swoop on the architectural surround look like a different shade of...
Because those look like they're engraved, and they're bitten in way deeper, so they carry way more ink. And you just said a magical word.
I did.
The figure holding a what?
Telescope.
Huh. I wonder...
We haven't seen one of those yet.
No, we hadn't, but isn't it interesting that Galileo was working in the court of Cosimo de' Medici at the time? And Callot actually had lessons on certain aspects of science and vision. Yeah, and vision.
Oh.
And so if you think about it, he's engraved a figure of a person looking at the events through a telescope. Every time you look at a Callot print, you go, how the hell did he manage to see all that? Do you suppose he was using a telescope? And finally I'm like, okay, this is like the poof, total face palm head slap thing. It's like, duh! Because you said aerial perspective, which it totally is. Right. Things seem to, it just...
Off.
They just wash away into the distance. And this is the clue right there. It is just right there. The story's being told to us. Isn't that a marvelous thing? Mm-hmm. So he's watching those with the telescope, which had been recently invented. As we know, it's our boy Galileo who had gotten into a little bit of trouble looking at those spots on the moon and saying, eventually he'd get in some trouble with the church and so on and so forth.
Because the Earth isn't flat?
Yeah, God isn't.
Is that what the problem was?
Copernicus certainly did.
Oh, Copernicus, right.
Copernicus said that in 1543.
Oh my God, how do you remember that?
Because it's the same year that this came out.
I see. Okay, people. Everyone needs a friend like Trip.
I'm sorry. But isn't it gorgeous?
Look at it.
I get a little excited. It just tells you everything right there. I finally, oh, for duh. And that's why I got so stoked about this. So Callot goes down to Florence after he'd left. So many artists had gone down to Rome. Like Poussin had even gone to Rome. Let's go learn some stuff. Let's go to Rome and look at the antiques. And Callot gets there and he's like, and he kind of has this reason to go to Florence. And now he's starting to work for the Duke de' Medici, and that's pretty exciting. Let's see, what else was I going to tell you? I don't want to have to talk about the Mannerists now, do I? But let's see, if you look at some of his work, you'll start to see Mannerism is still playing in there too. All right, so let's see.
This one also, the fan is 9 by 12 or something.
It's
pretty good size. Although there are bigger Callots.
There are, but wait, here. I got this little gift for you, Miss Ann.
Oh my. So there's a link that I'll put in the show notes that allows you to
see and if you think about the size of this thing, look at the difference in these lines.
Yeah.
Look how wide they are and how much ink they carry. And even at the scale of these figures, it suddenly started to make so much sense to me. Like, of course, Rembrandt really knew Callot's work. He loved it. And I talk about how Simeon, Rembrandt could describe that face with 3 or 7 little bitty lines. And you're looking at Callot putting faces on these things that are the size of the head of a pin. That's a society that understands vision in a new way. And I can see how this would have transferred to Rembrandt, but Rembrandt could do it all in etching. The other thing we can see on this particular image that's super clear is the swell and the taper, where Callot is using this échoppe, and you can understand how the calligrapher is moving that beveled tip. Now, we've had students, many a student for our History of Prints finals, do Callots, and we'll probably have to chit-chat about that. But this is Tres Crampé, okay? That means a good thing. Also notice how he silhouettes, or in the chiaroscuro of the foreground figures, he's using the thing that maybe Giotto had really started with. We're standing behind the figures that with their backs to us watching this event. Right. This is clearly an artist who is doing stagecraft. There's an operatic way of showing all of this greater, wider world. And I just adore this image. It's so ridiculous. It's so prodigally beautiful, you know. And you're like, yeah, it's just a festival and they were supposed to put it on their souvenir fans. Guess what? It's not all going to stay fluffy and light, because this is an artist that will take on some of the bigger, harder topics as well, as we shall soon see.
He's the first one that really goes for
totally
the hard
stuff.
Yeah, so.
And, you know, we could look at coats of arms and all the kinds of things. You know, the engravers were in high demand in courts because they were going to make those little things you wanted, like the gold objects, the salt cellars, the badges, the seals, the medals, all of these different. And so I'm showing a series of coats of arms that Callot had engraved. You can see that it's a functional kind of skill, as well as something that could be used artistically. But I think the idea of Callot understanding, hey, I could take this very staid technique of engraving and I can put this etching aspect to it, and he learned the etching processes really when he got down to Florence from this amazingly important person named Parigi, who was also in the same zone as all these other scholars and scientists that were still going to Florence because it was still a good, smart, safe place to be. Even though it wasn't as lavish as the days of Lorenzo the Magnificent back in the 1400s, it's still an important place that is still willing to spend a pile of money on its artwork, also to just show off how important they are. The more I started reading and realizing how incredibly important these artists' jobs were to enhance the visibility and the prestige of the families they're working for. We talk about conspicuous consumption and McMansions. Think about this silly festival and the enormity of that, or 2 months to do a damn funeral. That's what artists were supposed to do. And how do you separate yourself from all of that? The other thing I wanted to share with you, let's see. Callot was living in a time when the Catholic Church is getting its feet back under it after having been given these huge blows by the Protestant. It's getting its power back underneath it. It's established the Spanish Inquisition. Many people are working for that new order of the Jesuits that are spreading their gospel throughout the world, or the Great Counteroffensive, the Catholic Counter-Reformation. But it's interesting, many of them will say that Callot wouldn't be right on the front lines. In fact, you might think when we look at the miseries of war that he was leading the charge of what art should be. He didn't want to get that involved in it, but he was definitely going to view the time, the oddities of his time, the people, every class, every stripe of individual, and make those visible to others. But it wasn't like he was trying to grind an axe and prove a new way. The thing that I think we've been able to overmap onto it was just how open he was to the varieties of subject matters that he was going to give us. So I'm going to show you the next wonderful image, which is called the Ferret Impruneta. And there are many that would say this is his tour de force, but I don't know. I think he has a lot of tours de force. The Ferret Impruneta is an event in a village just outside of Florence, and this is done in 1620, and this is huge. It's 16 and a half by 26. Yeah. It's huge for Callot. That's like the size of Rhode Island, right? And it's fascinating to see that he is showing in this image every possible stripe of humanity that is there. And it's interesting also the church that's in the background. I think it's an important kind of anchor to the scene, but it's also a stable presence. That is a church that supposedly had a relic of an image of the Virgin that had been painted by St. Luke.
Oh.
So it made it a pilgrimage
Luke
site.
was the painter?
Yeah, yeah. St. Luke was supposedly the one that did the first portrait of the Virgin Mary.
I did not
and
know
that is why St. Luke is the patron saint of the Guild of Painters.
That's something new.
It's a thing. But we have the church here, but we also have all kinds of other things happening. Now, I'm going to just put Ann on the spot and say, what are you noticing? Anything you want to share with your listeners?
Yeah, sure. It's very much set up in the way that we've come to expect from him, which is that there's a front, sort of darkened proscenium front of stage.
Like a repertoire element,
There you go.
something that pushes everything back. That was somebody in my graduate seminar. It's a repertoire.
I never would have used that term.
Yeah, but I
It's not
suddenly
supposed to
realized it's
confuse
there.
people.
It's pushing everything out. Yeah.
There's a framing tree on the right and then a sort of falling apart building on the left. And then there's just groups and groups of people milling around in front of this church, which is in the sort of middle to far background. But then there's still more mountains behind the hills.
The Tuscan beautiful. If you
Yeah.
think about Tuscany and that.
Someone's getting hanged.
Oh yeah, they are.
Oh, fuck.
Thank you. I'm sorry that the guy's getting hanged.
I'd forgotten about this.
But that's the thing. See, this image has everything.
Lynching.
Yes. So let me see. I can give you numbers if you want. There are over 1,000 figures in this image.
What? Who counted? Jesus.
Somebody,
Lord
okay?
have mercy.
You know.
Would have been probably in a book because it's all the ones I've seen have a fold down the middle of them.
Yes. No, actually, it's two sheets of paper.
2 plates.
Yeah, and joined, but look how beautifully joined it is.
Yeah.
Huge copper plates.
So we're looking at Linda Holtz's The Prince in the Western World.
And it's
book.
interesting to see how the scholarship has changed a little bit since she threw it out there. She has some wonderful points, but I'm not sure I buy into her saying that he's completely impassive about the way he takes things in. Nevertheless, the tour de force of the fair at Impruneta, this outdoor scene, is the elegant coexists with the coarse and gruesome, as she says. This spectacular grand machine of an etching contains, by one count, 1,138 figures, 45 horses, 67 donkeys, and 137 dogs. Yeah.
Wow.
It's magnificent. I'm just telling you what Linda said, Dr. Holtz. Its magnificent sweeping space gives us a bird, and that's the other thing, his bird's eye view. How the heck is he putting this together? He's the drone at a time of no drones. That to me is amazing. If you go really looking forward through there, you can see all kinds of things. Like she says, a crippled beggar pushing a cart. We wouldn't say crippled now, but that would be in the time. 2 copulating dogs exactly in the center of the print. Everybody has to go looking now. That's your assignment. Someone suffering on the strapado, a torture device. It's like a 2-story tall rod. And the person is hoisted up with their arms and their legs tied behind them with a rope. Hoist, and they get them all the way up there, and then they let go of the rope and then yank on it just before they hit the ground, which of course dislocates the hips and the shoulders and the elbows, and it's a horrible way of being punished. And it's not the only time that Callot is going to show these kinds of things. And a hanging, because some of the crowd is going, hey, look, there's an event. Somebody's getting hung or drawn and quartered. That's part of it. But there's also clergy in there. There's also lovely people parading in their finery. And so you have the highest and the lowest elements of society.
Yeah, and on the right corner in the foreground by the tree, that somebody has built a platform so they can better see them.
Exactly. Like they might have their telescopes with them, if you will. And then there's a huge address at the bottom of it, which is quite lovely. And can you see the cartouche in the middle?
The Medicis.
Yeah, there's the shield of the Medici. So once you get used to seeing a shield that has 5 balls in it, those are the Malamerica. Those are the oranges. I call them the Medici balls, and my students all get it. But yes. Now, I wanted to share this with Ann too, because I went shopping, and so I found us some good zooms.
Oh, great.
The zooming in is a whole lot of fun. And your listeners, you're going to have a wonderful time zooming in. This is one of those things where you get out your magnifying glass and yeah, really? And then you start understanding why that would have dazzled Rembrandt, and that's why in The Three Trees, he's got all of those little Easter eggs hiding in there too. This thing is like a freaking Easter egg hunt. It's like, you don't even have to hunt. There are Easter eggs all over that field. But 1,100 figures in this massive print, I can't wait to see it in real life. I haven't seen it yet. Have you?
I don't think I have seen that.
I imagine it's pretty expensive. But even if you think about how much insane detail is in there, tiny, tiny, tiny. Even I have it now at a quarter to the size of the screen, but you can still see The thing that's fascinating is how he has managed to organize so many little elements. There's still it could be a messed up stew of crap. And what's your line? You always suggest that people try to make it as simple as you can without, what is it you try to tell the students at Micah?
Oh, you mean reducing down to the elements that you need to tell the story and no more?
Exactly. And he's done that.
Yeah.
But there's a logic to it. And I think in some respects you can almost say it is Mannerist in the way that it's got this centripetal force, and you can either like zero down into the church, or it feels like it's expanding out. But there's so much activity in there, and these elegant long figures and all of these.
Pathway, he leads you right into it. This is a very British landscape convention later on.
Exactly.
Leads you right back in the lower left.
You can pretend it's a river, and it's so stunning, really. And so the people could almost seem like they were groupings of trees, but then you realize, oh my God, each of those are little tiny people. It's just phenomenal. I can't wait to have you folks enjoy the link to being able to zoom in on it. So that is something from about 1620. And while he's still in Florence working for the Medici, he does a series, several series actually. One of them, one of the earliest ones, everybody calls it the Gobi, G-O-B-I. The translation, really, it's quite, can you say it with your French accent? Frontispiece from...
Verrier, figure, Gobi, suite appelée aussi les bossus,
les pygmies,
that's weird, les nains grotesques.
Various hunchbacked figures, the hunchbacks, the pygmies, and the grotesque dwarfs.
Oy.
1616 to 1622. And it's 19 little people plus a gorgeous frontispiece. And just so I don't want you to think that it's going to be something you can't manage. It's a whopping 2 3/8 inch high by 3 3/8 inch. Each plate is the size of a credit card.
Yeah.
Okay.
And it's a single figure on each with just a hint of a ground they're standing on, but nothing in the back.
And a lot of negative space.
Yeah.
Which is wonderful because, look, okay, the frontispiece. Did you hear this? This is great. See, here it says, Escudo. Actually, what this tells you is that he did do these in Nancy when he got back home. He made many little sketches and he could do them. And I think that's I miss it. But on the frontispiece of these various figures of dwarves by Jacques Callot of Firenze, and he saw them in the year 1616. Describe what he's given us on the frontispiece.
There's the central figure upon whose coat, the underside of his coat is where the words are, but the coat tails are being held up by other people. He's squatting with his bum hanging out. I assume he's about to defecate. Although
somebody's checking that.
There's somebody who's checking his hole.
Crack.
His crack. And then there's a hunchbacky guy on the right that has a peg leg, as it were.
The grotesque, wonderful face.
Yes, and there are lots of grotesques there.
And here's a wonderful opportunity to see that marvelous line that he's using his échoppe to create. Do you see how he's made that look like an engraving? Yes, engravings are well respected and highly regarded and very collectible. And it's just the cross contour in this guy's bum is quite remarkable. It's hilarious. Now, you might say, why is he doing a series on hunchbacks? This is the 17th century, and hunchbacks, people with dwarfism, anybody with a bodily difference, was really quite interesting and remarkable. And later in this little slideshow, I actually include a piece of a Velázquez Las Meninas, because dwarves and hunchbacks were part of the court. And they were special, interesting individuals, and people wanted to collect those unique and odd parts of life. We've got marvelous Gobi, and we'll talk about the positions. It's really fun to be able to see them just on each of these. It's an image where you can see them all lined up, and to me, it doesn't look like film stills.
Yes, for sure.
It's almost like you can see them rotating, but each one has a huge gut, one has a stumpy leg, they have different masks and faces, they have these elaborate different kinds of bodies.
With instruments and swords.
All kinds of marvelous things. The one that was always a big hit in class, because this is the one that Linda Holtz included in her book, is this rotund little fellow. And I don't know if the students realized that this was a person with dwarfism, but you see this gorgeous cross contour that creates the rotundity of this little buddy, and he's cute, isn't he cute?
He is cute.
And I remember Corey Cohn, for one. I had several. Aaron Womack made this. Corey Cohn made one. And I loaned my shop to somebody to do it. I think it was Womack that made her a shop out of a dowel and stuck a piece of coat hanger in there and beveled the end of it. And presto, she had in a shop and did a really respectable job of it. And then Corey Cohn said, I had loaned him mine, and he was an AV guy who was also a computer god, but he was also a painter. And he took history of prints. He was so much fun to have in class. But he said it was like trying to tame a Mustang that was leaping out of... He did just as carefully as he could to make these parallel lines, rotating each of them. If you think about the scale of this thing and the care that it took, and it's like ice skating. It's like you have to put that weight in just the right place to get this marvelous turn, and it's strangely beautiful. I can just see how these series would have been phenomenally popular. One of these Gobi. There's this little guy with a super droopy, has a fat apron, kind of a gut that's hanging down over his legs. I just want to see what Anne thinks about this little guy.
He does have this strange pendulous belly, and he's got this kind of, not a witch hat, but a cross between a witch hat and a pilgrim's hat.
With a gorgeous sort of pheasant feather, yeah.
Yeah, and he's got a little Van Dyke on.
Oh, is that possibly a self-portrait?
What?
It's possible that that's a self-portrait. There's
how
a
do you
couple,
figure?
because the literature says that he includes his face in it in a couple different places. And then when you look at images, he does a couple other self-portraits, and it's always got the little Van Dyke.
Oh,
and
interesting.
Yeah, I can see it. Look at that face. That's unlike.
It does look a bit like his portrait.
Very winsome.
Yeah.
It's just so beautifully done. So the Gobi is one series that he does, and it's just way too much fun.
Sorry, everybody. That's where I'm going to cut it off. We're about to run into the next series, which is, 25 prints or something, and it just seemed like a good place to stop. So you will have to wait for the conclusion of our episode on Jacques Callot the next time. I won't make you wait too long, I promise. Thank you, as always, to True for being my SME, the subject matter expert. He does a fabulous job, but you all know that. And a thank you, as always, to Michael Diamond for the use of his original music. As I mentioned at the top, any images that we talk about are over on the show notes at platemarkpodcast.com. And if you are watching this as a YouTube video, the images will come up as you watch, which, you're welcome. Please go over to platemarkpodcast.com and hit the support and donate button. Help me keep the lights on. And also leave us a message on that little microphone icon thing over at platemarkpodcast.com. You could leave us a 60-second voicemail, ask us a question, or, just tell us what you think. Okay, I think that's it. We will see you next time.